Welcome to Coffee with Cornelius, and thank you for joining us. If you enjoy this content, please hit the like button and subscribe if you would like to see more. Today we are here with Leonard Wantchekon. Dr. Wantchekon is a professor of politics at Princeton University, and we're going to be today talking about Dr. Wantchekon, a bit about his background. He has a fascinating background as a student activist in Benin, his native country. We're going to talk about his research into politics in Africa. And also we're going to be talking about the university he founded in his native Benin, the African School of Economics, which trains Africans in cutting edge economic techniques and research. Dr. Wantchekon, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Happy
to be here.
It's great to have you on. So, Dr. Wantchekon, I read in The Economist, there was a profile of you in that magazine. I read that you were a student activist in Benin, protesting against the then dictator Mathieu Kérékou.
Yeah.
This put you in a few dangerous situations. Would you tell us a little bit about that? Because that's just fascinating.
Yeah, so when I started college in 1979, I set up a student pro-democracy group, and we organized major kind of student protests in 1979. I was kicked out of the university for 5 years, in fact, for life. And I was on the run for 5 years. When there was an amnesty, and I came back in 1984. And in 84, we organized even a much bigger uprising this time that led to my arrest in July 1985. So I spent 1 year and a half in prison, managed to escape. And then when I escaped, I got a political refugee status to Canada. So I went to Quebec from Côte d'Ivoire, where I was a refugee. I was in Quebec for about 2 years. And then I went to UBC to start my PhD until I got my, and then I finished at Northwestern and then became professor afterwards. So I was not just a participant, I was actually one of the main leaders of the pro-democracy movement in Benin. And I think for me, it's clearly my most significant accomplishment because it was, democracy in Africa started from Benin with a national conference. And, I was part of a group that actually started a movement that led to democracy in Benin. So I'm extremely grateful and that I could survive this experience and be where I am today.
It's great. And it's a fascinating story. It's like a movie, in fact. It is, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a question, though. How did you escape imprisonment? That must have been a pretty interesting...
Okay, basically what I did was I made a lot of friends among the guards. And I was never somebody who is, I'm always somebody calm and collected, even on the, so I was not like, when I asked to get treatments outside the prison, I was given the opportunity to do it. And then I came back the first time. The second I asked, that time the surveillance was more relaxed. I came back, and then the third time I left. So anyway, it was a strategy that I set up to be able to leave. And obviously, I exaggerated my condition a little bit, to force the hands of the guard to let me outside. I describe all this in my autobiography, where I describe the steps that led me to escape. Was December 6, 1986. Yeah.
And that is a fascinating story. I'd like to ask, did your background in Benin and elsewhere, did that have any effect on your decision to study economics and get a PhD in the subject?
Interesting. Yeah. When I was in Benin, when I started college, I was math major. my big dream was to become a mathematician and a professor in mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I was in hiding for 5 years, a friend of mine brought me Das Kapital, the Karl
Right.
Marx. That's all I have to do. So I read it 20 times and I know every bit of it.
Wow.
And then I really like the elegance. I like the broad kind of knowledge that economics require.
Mm-hmm.
And part of Das Capital, especially book 2, was very analytical. It's very mathematical to some degree.
Right.
Like the first part is very philosophical and very broad, historical, philosophical. But the second part was very analytical and mathematical. So I got interested in economics. When I went to Laval, I enrolled in math. And then I decided to take an econ class. And I was induced to switch from math to economics. And they put me on a fast track program called Stage Probatoire pour la Maîtrise.
Mm-hmm.
So as opposed to doing math and finish in 4 years, I could get my bachelor degree in 1 year because
Whoa.
They put me on a
Wow.
fast track program. So because they knew that I have a potential,
Right.
especially given my math background and also my age. I was already 32.
Okay, right.
So I decided to switch then from mathematics to economics. And no, I think it was the best decision for me because I think economics give you so much flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
You can be very heavy, pure math and still be econ. You can love history, psychology, sociology, and
True.
still, anyway. So I like the fact that econ is more than a methodology today than it's about really a substantive topic, and I think I was very lucky. Not only get me to save 3 years,
Yeah, sure.
and then the fact that I can use my life experience and my math background, put all of them together, in my work, So I think it was really the perfect choice for me. Yeah.
I'd like to talk about your work because it is very unique and it's something that I don't think has been replicated anywhere else. Essentially, you managed to do a randomized field experiment with actual presidential candidates in an actual presidential election, first in 2001 in Benin, secondly in 2006 in Benin. Let's talk about the first research paper that came out of that. That was a 2003 article in World Politics.
Exactly.
And basically, in the midst of a countrywide presidential campaign in 2001, you managed to convince all of the candidates to engage in a randomized field experiment. First of all, how did you manage to convince these guys to go along with this?
I think my activist part and also the fact that I always try very hard to persuade people to do things that they may not have want to do otherwise, because I can get them to see where their interests lie.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, I was an economist by training, so I got into political science much later. So when I read political science, as a study, I was a political activist, but I never really took a political science class when I was in grad school. So when I started, I saw how simplistic, I should say, this very simplistic view that people have about African politics.
Mm-hmm.
I read that voters in Africa are intrinsically like clientelist. Like, for instance, they cannot vote on national interest. They cannot
Right.
vote on public goods. They can only vote based on material inducement, on
Hmm.
ethnic affiliation, you know. And
Ethnic affiliation. So like if you are the same tribe as the
exactly,
candidate. Okay.
yeah, you go along, and
Yeah.
then if people give you $5, then you will prefer voting for that person as opposed to somebody who promised a school for you, you know,
Right.
or that if you talk about a national program, for instance, reform the tax system, reform education system, people are not going to pay attention to you. So they are going to pay attention to you only if you focus very narrowly on what is in their immediate private interest.
Right.
So, and I thought that what is the most credible evidence that I can provide in support or not of this claim that people make about African politics? So as a result, I just went to politicians and I tell them that it will be good if, for instance, they take one message and they frame it as a part of a national program or something which is more targeted, narrowly targeted to the audience that they are talking to, you know? So, and then they are going to, we randomize basically the selection of the audience or, villages and communities and neighborhoods that they are going to provide this message. And then we are going to collect the data after the election to see how effective this was. But so, and what we decided to do is to go to a bit extreme, so the usual message is always a combination of something broad or something narrow. So that I get them to purify that message into something which is purely broad or purely narrow, Obviously, it's extremely hard to get people to vote positively on a purely broad message, because
Sure,
I mean,
yeah.
you cannot vote for a national program unless you see to what extent it affects you.
Yeah.
So we did that. So we made it hard for the broad message to be effective so that we can see maybe people, individuals, group who still are responsive to that. You see what I mean? So, and we run it and we find that the narrowly focused message is more effective in general. But in places that are more cosmopolitan, is more effective. The broad message is more effective. Right. And the broad-based message was more effective among women than men, more effective among among voters who are more educated than those who are less educated, So it was an eye-opening for me, first methodologically, because I was using, randomized control trial, real political setting. But then I was able to understand that even though narrowly targeted message might be effective, the broad-based message can equally be effective depending on gender, depending on social economic conditions of the audience. So it's possible that, in fact, the broad-based message that we see even in very developed democracies, it can be effective even in new democracies, So, and I was encouraged by the fact that, women in particular, for instance, in fact, were more progressive, or not progressive, were more kind of supportive of this kind of messages, because, you can understand the reason why this might be the case, because they are not the best, they are not the beneficiaries of mostly targeted program among politicians. So, and they may have, There may be, there
So does
are.
that mean that the money would be going mainly to the men of the household?
Yeah, I mean, so and what we did here is not even about money. It's not
Right.
about, because the issue here is policy.
Okay.
When the policy is defined, explained in such a way that it's very, very, very targeted. Like, for instance, I'm going to build a school for you,
Hmm.
for this village, versus I have an education program for the whole country that
Right.
will mean building a school. So your community might benefit directly or not. But what I have in mind is something for the country as a whole. You
Hmm.
see what I mean? Anyway, but I think the point you wanted to make is the fact that I was able to get politicians to test that idea, and they agree because they want to learn, They agree also because, they cannot campaign everywhere in the country. So they may as well select randomly places where that they can live for research, if you will, And since then, similar projects have been run, in Asia, in Canada, in France, in the US. So I think this project, to some degree, led to the wider use
Yeah.
of randomized control trial in elections, in politics in general, and in election in particular. Yeah.
Yeah, and it is used today very broadly now. Now,
Right.
somebody who's just watching this and who's listening to you will say, well, that doesn't seem so bad. I like clientelism. I want a school to be built in my own town. I don't care about, Toronto. I want a school to be built here in St. Catharines. But essentially, clientelism can lead to other problems, right? It can lead to maybe pernicious effects. Could you talk a little bit about those in the context of
Yeah, okay.
Africa? Yeah.
The issue with clientelism
Yeah.
is that it could well be that what you need, what Toronto needs, is in priority is roads, and what maybe Mr. Soga needs in priority is hospital and school. You
Right.
see what I mean? So if a politician doesn't have a national view of the issues and have very opportunistic view, it will lead to misallocation of resources. Like, for
Hmm.
instance, places that needs a given public good more will not get it.
I see.
But exactly. So if, because the allocation of public good has to depend on, some kind of welfare maximization, uh, you know, function. It shouldn't
Right.
be just driven by elections. Like,
Right.
not about, oh yeah, this guy, if I tell them that I'm going to bring school for them, they vote for me. Okay, I'm just
Hmm.
going to vote for them. I'm going to give school for them for that reason. But in fact, they might need the school less than other people.
Yeah.
So result and so on. So that's one issue. The second issue is that, usually to be able to get the other issue of clienteling, not just misallocation, it's corruption, because
Hmm.
typically you need somebody who might be, a local activist or a local chief or some kind of broker to be your messenger in the community.
Right.
And if you want to target people, you need somebody from the community that you're going to recruit, and that person is going to drive that message home for you. And typically in a clientelist network, that person, for instance, you might need to promise him a job when you get elected, so that he can deliver the clientelist message for you. Well, he might not be the most efficient, the most competent person to hold a position in your government. He might not
Mm-hmm.
be the most, qualified person. And worse, when he's elected, he or she wants to be rewarded for helping you to win the election locally. And as a result, you can close your eyes on corruption thing that he might be doing because he or she is being rewarded, So you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So clientelism is not just the fact that it leads to misallocation, like roads being built where it's not needed, hospital or airport being built nowhere because you needed to get people to vote for you.
Mm-hmm.
But also, clientelism tends to involve local brokers who you might have to hire once you are in office, and that drives corruption. But not only small corruption, but grand corruption.
Right.
Because if I got the Toronto vote for you, you are a candidate, I got the Toronto vote for you, and it was big. So my reward is that I'm going to become Minister of Transportation. And I know that in 2 years, I have to recuperate, I have to get all the investment that I made to get you elected. So you are going to close the eyes on every shady deal that I've made so that you see what I mean?
Yeah, I
And
see what you mean. Yeah.
corruption is driven in large part by clientelist practices,
Yeah.
So clientelism is not just like bad for the allocation of public goods because it's politicized as opposed to driven by national interest, but also it's in large part the driver of corruption,
So to what extent do Western nations have a problem with clientelism? Because I can think of a situation, and I'm not going to, I'm not going to say any names here, but like if you're the government of Canada, surely you have to appoint a few Quebecois people, right? I mean,
So that's very interesting. That's a very, very important point. So it's a myth that clientelism is observed only in developing countries.
Yeah.
Because misallocation of resources, as I just described, is something more or less universal. And patronage politics, the one that I just described, is something which is more or less universal. So obviously, it might be worse in some countries than others, because in Canada, you might have laws that help you check who the next Minister of Finance is.
Yeah.
Then there might be popular outcry if he or she is clearly there, as a reward for his campaign contribution. There might be some limitation of the extent of the damage of clientelism because of the states is strong, the judiciary, the legal institution can help prevent some of the degree of corruption that you observe. You see what I mean?
Right, yeah.
So as a result, clientelism is not something which is black or white, it's a matter of degree. Like you might have worse from clientelism in Latin America, Africa, but clientelism, patronage politics as a whole, it's everywhere. And this is also one of the things that I would like to show in my research, because there is a sense in which, politics in those countries, it's very, very different from politics here. Like over there, nobody votes based on, ethnic affiliation. Well, nobody votes here. And, you don't have patronage politics here. No, that's not true. So anyway, I mean, politics look alike almost everywhere. Institutions can reduce the worst form of corruption, the worst form of clientelism in some places, not others. So anyway, so that's what the kind of research that I do help to show.
Well, if it's not a problem that's unique to Africa, of course, it isn't. What can we do to reduce clientelism? You had a paper, I think, in 2011, AEJ Applied,
yes.
American Economic Journal Applied, which speaks a little bit to this.
Yeah.
What can we do to reduce it?
Yeah, that's a great point. So in fact, after I did the first paper and I showed that, well, clientelism work, and I explained why it works, my next question was, how can you make programmatic, public goods oriented, national public good oriented platform as effective as, so it become like a normative exercise, how you promote what is good. But then it's going to be about testing strategies, testing electoral strategies that will make what is good not only in the best interest of the candidate, but also of the country. You see what I mean? So I think national, public good platform is good for the country, but then is there a way you can make it as effective electorally as the clientelist platform? So, and then I came with an idea, which is what I call policy deliberation. So you run your campaign not based on big rallies, big, show one-way communication, big meetings kind of strategies, but instead more like foot soldier oriented, town hall meeting oriented campaign. So there I talked to the main political parties. We randomized places where they run the electoral campaign based on town hall meeting in some areas, or the business as usual, like big meetings elsewhere.
Right.
So same platform, but the communication strategy is different. In one place is interactive, deliberative. In another place is one-way communication. You see what I mean? Like, okay, in a rally, I speak to you and to get you excited, and I leave. The other place, I will provide a short summary of what I stand for, and then there are discussions back and forth, and then the meeting ends based on a platform which is new, which is the result of this kind of interaction between the audience and the politician. Okay, so town hall meeting versus rallies, those were the two strategies that we tested. So, and we find that in fact, town hall meeting, despite being 10 times cheaper, were more effective than rallies. So, and the result was so strong that in fact, we tried the same thing in the Philippines. We also run a project in the Philippines, and it confirmed the original finding that
Amazing.
we find. So why this was the case? Well, we find that town hall meeting was effective for 2 or 3 reasons. The first one is information, because people ask you specific questions about your platform, and you provide more explanation, that get them to have a better understanding of what you stand for.
Yeah.
So the reason why the national kind of platform kind of program was not effective, it was because it was too opaque, too vague. It was just a statement of vision. It's not necessarily something practical that people can vote on. You see what I mean? So that was one. The second one is people can comment, add, and they can even suggest items that you haven't thought about before. So as a result, that campaign becomes not only your campaign, but their campaign. Their platform, the platform that you are going to implement, because it had been amended, adjusted, customized by the audience, it becomes their own campaign as much as it's yours. So you feel more empowered. You see what I mean? And then third, because of that, the participant to the town hall meeting turn themselves into unpaid activists on your behalf. They are more likely to go out and share your platform with others than in a place where it was just one-way communication. You see what I mean? So if you want clarity, if you want empowerment, if you want individuals to share your platform more widely, then a town hall meeting campaign strategy is the way to go. You see what I mean?
See, yeah.
So we find that, so what is interesting here is that when we think about political campaign, the substantive aspect is important, but the technology of communication part is equally important. And the technology of communication is not necessarily very fancy kind of technology, to get people to believe in this or that. Is also the level of engagement, the level of ownership that you want the audience to have on your campaign. So this is that was a very, very big project. And then what we are doing currently, we are applying to do it in other countries, in other settings. This idea of deliberation, like engagement as a way to improve, basically to improve the chances that good platform gets candidate elected. And why this is also very important is the fact that because it's cheaper, you can, because I mean a rally you have maybe I don't know 100 times more people in a rally than in a town hall meeting, and as a result, and in a big rally you have to spend more because you have to, logistics is more expensive.
So this is something I wanted to ask you about, actually, is I definitely get that it's cheaper for politicians to engage in a town hall meeting.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, what I care about as a politician is whether I get elected in. Which one has a bigger bang for the buck, right? Like, so the amount of money I spend versus the amount of votes I get. Are politicians really going to be incentivized to adopt a town hall?
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that,
yeah,
in fact, the places where they run a town hall meeting, they have higher vote share than
really.
places.
Okay.
Yes.
Wow. Yes.
In the Philippines, because we run it with smaller parties, the vote share increase was by 50%.
Wow.
Benin, it was done by bigger candidates, major candidates, by 7%. But it works better for opposition and new candidate than it works for incumbent.
Okay.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So if you are a new candidate, for instance, opposition candidate running, clearly town hall meeting style is the best strategy. And even for incumbents, their vote share does not significantly increase, but it's cheaper.
It is cheaper. So the bang for the buck is better either way.
Exactly.
So in other words, I guess the Trump campaign should consider town hall meetings instead of rallies.
Yeah, but then obviously they might not like what happened after at the town hall meeting.
That is true. Yeah, that is.
Yeah, because point. I mean, if you have a positive message, if you have an inclusive message, then you might consider a town hall meeting. But if you have divisive, you have a negative, and this might not be the place. So clearly, candidates that you and I and most people would like to run, who that you like this kind of candidate to run, and people who have positive, inclusive message, but they don't have the money, and also it's not something that will get people excited immediately because it's not necessarily controversial. A town hall meeting style campaign is effective. But the broader message here is that we should not only think about what politician or what policy ought to be implemented, we also need to think about strategies, technologies that politicians has to put in place to achieve, and which one is the most cost effective, which one is also the best in terms of voter education, in terms of voter empowerment, in terms of getting voters activism, in
Okay,
election.
yeah.
Because that's what you want. You want, for instance, that people by themselves go door to door to spread your message. It's not only good for the candidate, it's also good for democracy.
Absolutely. Word of mouth, right?
Exactly. It's also good for democracy, especially people do it because they believe in what you are saying, what you are doing, not because they get paid to do it. Yeah.
For sure. I'd like to take a little bit of a detour here, and I'd like to skip ahead a little bit because I'd like to go back a little bit in history. You do economic history in addition to your work on politics.
Yeah.
Fascinating work. You have done some work on education and human capital in Africa. Now, there's this narrative among some historians, and it's a bit of a caricature, I think. This caricature that missionaries in colonies were uniformly bad. They arrived with the sole aim of indoctrinating young African minds, with imperialism and ideas of white superiority and so on. And there might be some truth to it. I'm sure there is. But is this characterization true? And to what extent is it true, or is it false, for that matter?
No, that's a good question. So,
Yeah.
the same way I grew up as a political activist, and that shaped the work that I do. I also grew up in a very unique place, which is the place that has the first, or one of the very first, Catholic school in the whole West Africa.
No way.
So it was the village is called Zanyanado. That's where I was born. My parents were subsistence farmers, but 2 kilometers away from where I was born, one of the first Catholic schools was created. Okay, so the people who created those schools, they were really missionaries in a true sense. They work like 3 months to get there. They set up a school that was burned down. They rebuilt it. And the first cohort, they worked from village to village to get the cohorts. And they got, so they even died. I mean, they died very young. I mean, especially the founder of the school died when he was 32. He came there when he was 24. So
crazy.
they were true missionaries.
Yeah.
So, and what I did in my work is to try to understand the impact of that school on social mobility and the mechanism of that mobility. What I did, I was inspired by the fact that clearly that school changed the lives of my family, because my uncle went to that school, and my uncle was really the light of the whole community. His success inspired the whole community to the point where in my generation, up to 90%, I mean, he went to school in 1909, and like 30 years later or 40 years later, no, I should say 60 years later, when people from my generation, the primary school enrollment rate when I was born was about 90%. So places with no school in low school in the 19th century or early 20th century, primary school rates, enrollment rate in those places were about 25%. But where I was born, it was about 90%. Amazing. In the village I was born, I grew up with people from my cohorts, more or less. We had about 40, 50 kids from the village. And the village population was about 320. But kids from my age were about 40. 13 of those 40 has PhD.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and like you think of Leonard, there are people from my village who are now medical doctors in Germany, in Martinique, France. The former ambassador of Benin in Russia is from my village. The number 2 in Vatican, Cardinal Gantin, his name is.
No, I know who that guy is.
From my village. He's from Zayanado. So I mean, like,
right.
the village has spectacular level of social mobility. So
Yeah.
use micro data, especially in environments where early exposure to education creates a high demand for education.
Mm-hmm.
In those places, you see a very high level of social mobility. And what is interesting is mobility were stronger among people who early on, that people early on did not go to school, but were living near a school. You see what I mean? So what drives mobility in my community is not the fact that mobility was not driven entirely by those whose grandparents went to school. They were driven by people who are living near them, who get inspired by the success of those people. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So if you look rigorously using microdata, it's very, very difficult to argue that education was bad for social mobility. It's the total opposite. Now, here is the story. If you did not have extractive institutions like forced labor, repression, the level of mobility coming from education would have been much higher than it is.
Okay.
If the economy were based more on productive institutions as opposed to, like productive with firms and private sector development, as opposed to more rentier type kind of institutions, because most people who went to school those days, they went to public service. They became like, they work for the colonial administration. Assume that there were investment that enabled them to even create, their own company and firms and so on, using their knowledge to develop local economies. The level of mobility would have been much higher. So if it's true that colonial institutions, political institutions, they may not have necessarily positive impact on long-term development, but places that you have more education, this negative impact was much weaker.
Amazing.
You see what I mean?
Right.
So that's the story. The story is that education cannot be to blame. It's perhaps the extractive institutions.
I see.
That may be to be blamed, and the effect of education might be much stronger, much bigger if, the institutions were more productive as opposed to more extractive. Do you see what I mean?
Right.
So I would think that if anything, education limited the pervasive effect of colonialism. And I mean, I tell people all the time that if to exploit, if to to oppress, your strategy is to educate, then that's you're not really smart.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make any sense. So,
right, yeah.
So, I mean, education is something that goes in the interest of a colonial administration, the colonial institution? Yes, but education in particular makes Africans who were educated and their neighbors much better off than those who were not. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Something that I admire about you, Dr. Wantchekon, is that you have put a lot of your research into practice and you've put a lot of your principles into practice. And you founded something called the African School of Economics. This is a graduate level school. It trains African students in the latest techniques and the latest methods, latest research. Tell us a little bit about the African School of Economics.
Yeah. So basically, the question you ask about education is something that I find personally inspiring, because if a school set up in 19th century can produce someone like me today, well, I should be inspired by that and do something on my own. So I decided to set up, a cutting edge, research oriented economics program in Benin. So very limited infrastructure, very limited resources. and yet the curriculum is very much like, you know, the any top econ program, you know. So very, very selective. You know, we select students, you know, based on tests and based on academic performance, very selective, but also relatively cheap. You know, students pay about $2,400 a year. And how do we pay for how we pay for the program? Through research. So basically 80%, 85% of the revenue of the school is based on research contract, you know. Cool. Like for instance, the project I have been describing to you, the political economy project, the education project, they were all, you know, they were run through the school, you know. So results of that is for the past 5 years, we have been able, we placed about 20 students to top PhD program in the US. So we have a student from this school who are in Calgary, who are in Ottawa, who are in Montreal, Princeton, NYU, Wisconsin, and so on. Many of them are working at the World Bank, UNDP. So in terms of resources invested and the result, I mean, it's just, the gap is huge. So, and what we are doing is to use this model, this successful model, combining like math, microeconomics, economic history, and research, and try to take it in several places in Africa, like the missionary used to do, or the best missionary used to do. Yeah, my missionary were perhaps the best, but I'm not going to claim that every missionary across Africa in 19th century were like mine. Anyway, so currently we opened the program in Cote d'Ivoire, and we are planning to open it in Congo, in Mauritius, in South Africa, in other places, you know. And so the goal is to really to revolutionize like economic research, like you and I have been exposed to across Africa, so that we have a better representation of Africans in economic research at the top level, but also that we can provide very valuable kind of advice and support for government and private sector across Africa. So that's what I have been doing, and I'm very glad that the economics article that you mentioned, you know, gave a lot of visibility. Because it's very, very different. You know, like when people set up universities, they think about, you know, well, we got 60 million from the Gates Foundation. We have this big campus, 100 hectares, you know. But, you know, little attention to the curriculum,
the content,
and I think we want to move away from that model, and we spend a lot of money on faculty and research, you know, to make sure that we produce, you know, first class. So I'm extremely excited about this, and especially given that the fact that we'll be expanding. So let me tell you one more thing about that school before I leave. In fact, we are going to set up a small program in Harlem, New York, in partnership with the CUNYs, so that it will allow us to do the same training that we do in Africa for young African to African American here, and also to facilitate exchange between African diaspora in general and Africa.
That is so cool.
Yeah. So, and again, it's not anything grandiose. We are going to set up, you know, a joint program with some local universities. Why Harlem? Because for obvious reasons, Harlem is Africa, you know, and African culture, African diaspora. So having students there, students from Africa there, it's something that will create an environment that's very conducive, you know, to not only to technical training, but also students who are extremely well versed in African history and African culture. Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you. And, you know, we're getting near the end of the interview. I'd like to just ask you, Dr. Wantchekon, though, where can we find you? Do you have a Twitter? Do you have a website? Could you just let us know about that? Yeah.
So my Twitter is at Wantchekon,
Mm-hmm.
and I have a Facebook page. I also have my Princeton University website. Anybody type my name, they'll find me on the Princeton University website. So yeah, so that's basically you can find me anywhere. Website, Princeton, Twitter at Wantchekon, my Facebook page, and yeah, so that's what it is. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wantchekon. This has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate it.
My
And
pleasure.
thank you.
Yeah.
And, God bless you and your initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank
Have a good
you.
one.
Thank you for the opportunity. Okay. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.